The morning air is grey and damp, clinging to the rubble like breath held in fear. Somewhere on the Western Front in the bitter winter of 1944, where silence is never empty and every shadow carries intention. A single infantryman moves carefully through a half-shattered street, boots brushing broken glass, the sound too loud in the quiet. His rifle is stiff in his hands from the cold. Frost gathers on the burned-out window frames around him like pale ash. He does not know he is being watched. Half a mile away, hidden behind a collapsed stone wall, a sniper steadies his breathing and presses his cheek against cold metal. The rifle has already been zeroed. The wind is measured. The trigger is taken up, slowly, and then the shot fractures the morning. A sharp, cracking sound tears through the air. The soldier feels something slam into his chest, not pain at first, just a force violent, stunning like being punched by the war itself. He falls backward into debris, numbness crawling through his arms. Then, after a hollow second that feels like a lifetime, he realizes he is still breathing. And inside his coat, buried in fabric above his heart, a small bent coin is growing warm. By the winter of 1944, the Second World War had become a battlefield of nerves as much as one of artillery. And nowhere was that psychological dimension more concentrated than in the invisible duel between infantry and sniper, a struggle that unfolded not across maps or front lines, but through broken windows, tree lines, shell craters, and the narrow apertures of ruined cities from Stalingrad to Keene to the forests of the Ardennes. Sniping, once a marginal tactic in earlier conflicts, had evolved into a fully industrialized instrument of death by World War II, trained into doctrine by every major army involved, refined through hard data and brutal trial. German forces, shaped by First World War lessons and obsessive marksmanship culture, fielded specialized Scharfschützen units equipped with Mauser K98 rifles, fitted with precision optics like the Zeiss-Sylvier or Ajax scopes, while Soviet forces, hardened by the siege of cities and scorched earth warfare, built entire training schools around precision killing, producing figures such as Vasily Zaitsev in Stalingrad, whose confirmed kills numbered in the hundreds and whose reputation became as lethal as his rifle. The British, initially slow to adapt, developed their own sniper schools by 1942, while American forces, forced by experience in North Africa and Italy to acknowledge what manuals had underestimated, began formally training designated marksmen and integrating sniper spotting teams into infantry doctrine. But statistics only told part of the story. In the field, the fear snipers generated was out of proportion to their numerical presence. A single unseen rifle could freeze an entire platoon into the ground. Men avoided lighting cigarettes. Helmets were dragged across rubble tied to string as bait. Steel shovels were raised above trenches to test for death. The sniper did not need to kill everyone he needed, only to kill one in a way that echoed. That was the real weapon, uncertainty. Unlike artillery, which announced itself with thunder, or tanks, which roared into sight like machines of iron, the sniper arrived in silence. His bullets came from nowhere. There were no warning bells, only the crack of impact and the sudden absence where a human being had stood. In forests, men learned that birds falling silent meant a rifle was raised somewhere unseen. In ruined towns, they learned that a second-story window meant death. In open ground, they learned that distance itself was a lie. Soldiers came to believe not illogically that they were hunted. And unlike bombs, which struck indiscriminately, the sniper chose his victim. That knowledge settled into units like Frost, slow and numbing, reshaping behavior, posture, breath. Soldiers walked bent. Helmets were tilted lower. Men learned to move not like men but like shadows. No movement without reason. No glance without fear. For the sniper, it was not about numbers. It was about pressure. And by 1944, pressure was a currency as powerful as ammunition, because every army understood something essential. The battlefield was no longer just a place of impact. It was a place of watching. and the watched did not move the same way as the unwatched. That truth followed every infantryman into the streets, into the snow, into the fog, and into moments when a single object in a pocket could become the difference between a name toasted in a mess hall and a body lowered into Europe's frozen soil. If snipers represented the invisible edge of death, then the ordinary infantryman carried the weight of inevitability in ways rarely recorded in official history. Not only in the ammunition slung across his shoulders or the rifle biting into his palm, but in what rested quietly in the pockets sewn into his uniform, small objects pressed against skin that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with remaining human inside it. By 1944, the average Allied infantryman carried between 60 and 80 pounds of gear, a burden of steel, fabric, and tools meant for survival. Entrenching shovels, field dressings, rations, spare socks, grenades, maps folded into illegible paper scars, and along with it all, personal items that no regulation could eliminate, coins tucked away from home, pictures of wives or children creased to softness, letters folded smaller with each rereading, rosary beads wound around fingers in the dark, cigarette tins dented with history, medals worn not for display but against the chest like charms. These objects were not accessories. They were anchors. Every army tolerated them, knowing they mattered in ways no field manual could chart. In Wehrmacht units, soldiers often kept pfennig coins stitched inside tunics as good luck tokens. In British regiments, pocket Bibles were common. Thin pages, soft as cloth from nervous handling. American soldiers kept Liberty coins, wedding rings, short notes from home, prayer cards from parishes long shelled into silence. Soviet troops carried simple metal icons or smoothed river stones believed to bring protection. None of it was official. And all of it mattered. Uniform design itself reflected vulnerability rather than invincibility. Wool tunics layered over cotton undergarments offered little resistance to modern ammunition. Front breast pockets lay directly over lungs and heart. Buttons aligned over arteries. The helmet protected mainly from falling shrapnel, not bullets. The human chest, when exposed to military-grade rifle fire, stood almost no chance. Physicians knew it. Soldiers sensed it. And yet, even surrounded by ballistic reality, superstition thrived not as foolishness, but as defense against helplessness. In hospitals from Normandy to Poland, military surgeons documented strange survivals. Bullets deflected by cigarette cases, slowed by notebooks, fragmented by belt buckles, bruised by small metal objects caught in soft tissue. These were not miracles, only physics amplified by probability, and yet among soldiers they became legend. A man lived because a photograph took the bullet's edge. A Bible split a fragment's path. A coin flared around just enough to miss a ventricle. These stories travelled faster than orders, whispered from bunk to bunk and foxhole to foxhole. Not as science but as hope shaped into metal and paper. And so men arranged their pockets with care, not out of strategy but belief, sliding photos higher, coins closer to the heart. Small rituals sewn into cotton and nerves as the world erupted around them. These choices were not made with expectation of survival. They were made because something in the human mind refuses to face death without first placing something in between. And in the frozen miles of Europe, under artillery skies and among rifle shadows, such decisions sometimes became something more than comfort. Very rarely, impossibly, they became armor. From the outside, it is easy to imagine war as movement and noise, columns of men, roaring engines. Skies full of fire, but from the inside, war is often stillness. Fear stretched thin over hours of waiting, and it is there, in that suspended quiet, that the human angle of survival reveals itself most clearly. Because soldiers did not experience combat as sequences of victory or defeat, but as a continuous negotiation with dread. A negotiation in which tiny routines carried enormous weight. Men learned which rank in a patrol attracted fire, how to walk without attracting a sniper's eye, how to shift shoulders when crossing an open alley so that the chest did not square itself to fate. And in that constant awareness lived a quiet ritual, touching what remained human. Fingers brushed photographs. Thumbs rolled coins smooth through fabric. A flat piece of metal became a reminder of home, of streets untouched by shellfire and hands that did not tremble when tying shoelaces in darkness. The human nervous system, wired for safety and familiarity, sought refuge not in weapons but in memory, and memory lived inside pockets. Yet alongside that emotional shelter grew a tactical understanding of vulnerability. An acceptance that the rifleman was expendable in the arithmetic of war, that snipers did not aim for heroism but anatomy. The chest was not symbolic, it was efficient, a center of mass that did not shift, that offered heart and lungs in the same plane. Manuals told soldiers to aim for silhouettes. Snipers learned exactly where buttons lined arteries and where straps crossed ribs. A man standing upright offered geometry. In street fighting, snipers aimed low in windows because instinct drew eyes upward. In forests, they waited for the pause between steps, when movement ceased and certainty returned. Yet no tactical doctrine could sterilize the moment of impact. Bullets did not always obey the diagram. Wind bent them. Fabric slowed them. Bone deflected them. And once in a great while, meant for death, metal meant for memory. Technological reality collided with human habit. Rifle rounds of the era 7.92 Mauser, .3006 Springfield, 7.62 x54R were built to tear through barriers, but they were not perfect. At certain ranges, at certain angles, hitting irregular shapes carried in soft cloth pockets, unpredictable things happened. Copper jackets split. Lead cores flattened. Forces scattered. The bullet did not disappear, but its certainty fractured. And so within the same war that produced the most mechanized killing in history existed rare moments where the personal interrupted the ballistic, where something small, something never meant to be armor intruded into history's machinery and bent it, not out of intention, but coincidence. And in that thin margin between certainty and accident, survival was born not through courage, not through planning, but through the quiet physics of chance brushing against the evidence of a life once lived elsewhere. Leadership in war often spoke in absolute duty, honor, sacrifice, but survival existed in conditional clauses. And soldiers knew that no speech could reassemble a body opened by precision fire, which is why doctrine, no matter how eloquent, met reality only in fragments. Commanders told men that helmets and discipline would carry them through, that visibility could be reduced to tactics, that training could soften chaos into comprehension, yet the truth taught itself more honestly in the field. War did not reward obedience, it tolerated coincidence. Snipers on the opposite end of the equation understood this just as deeply, though in a darker vocabulary. Many wrote in journals not of pride but of numbness, describing their work not as killing men, but as eliminating shapes, a language that kept survival on both sides possible. German sniper Sepp Allerberger later recorded that he avoided faces, not out of mercy but necessity, seeing a human expression made the rifle heavier. Soviet snipers wrote of learning to wait until breath no longer trembled, until fear bored itself into calm, until efficiency replaced emotion. They did not seek duels, they sought stillness. They selected targets for posture, not identity stance, not story. And yet back in the platoons, among those being hunted, superstition rose into the gaps that leadership and probability could not fill. Helmets were scratched with dates. Names were sewn into undershirts. Objects were kissed, cursed, carried. Not because soldiers believed they were invincible, but because belief itself dulls terror. Faith did not need accuracy, it needed endurance. In this moral economy of fear, a coin in the pocket was not protection. It was protest. Protest against a war that reduced men to trajectories. Against a math that erased birthplaces and mothers' voices. Against artillery maps that could not remember anyone's name. And so the question of fate emerged not from politics but trenches. Did survival mean something, or did it simply happen? Was the man spared because moment chose him, or because something within him refused to yield. Soldiers debated this in hushed tents and over bitter coffee. Some said luck. Some said God. Some said nonsense. But all of them touched their pockets when the shelling slowed. And so when survival came not from a rifle or from doctrine, but from something quiet and private carried across oceans, it did not feel like an accident, it felt like defiance made real. A story not written in reports but folded into fabric and later unfolded in trembling hands. A moment when war reached for a heart and found an object in the way. A thin sheet of metal. A worn edge. A stranger from home. And the war, for once, blinked. The shot that should have ended his life arrived without drama, without warning, without even a sound he could separate from the other noises gnawing at the morning. Only a sudden, staggering impact in the chest that felt less like pain than interruption. As though something colossal had entered his body and then immediately changed its mind. And he fell backward into the ruin with the stunned disbelief of a man who had already accepted death and now did not know where to put it. Snow and dust mingled against his face. His rifle clattered away across broken brick. There was no smoke from the sniper's muzzle that he could see. No second shot. Just ringing silence and the numb pressure spreading beneath his coat as his hands shook their way toward his chest. Expecting wetness, expecting heat, expecting the world to end inside his ribs. But what his fingers found instead was not a hole. It was warmth, not the warmth of blood, but the warmth of metal pressed into skin by impact. Somewhere beneath layers of wool and cotton, something had been driven against his breast with violent certainty. Something small and hard and burning from friction. Something that did not belong in the anatomy of a man. The bullet had arrived on a near horizontal trajectory, fired from an elevated position not more than 300 yards away, a range where ballistic drop was minimal and velocity remained murderous. It struck the pocket squarely, that soft rectangle of cloth where a human being keeps fragments of a life untouched by war, and in that instant the bullet's journey met resistance it could not anticipate. A thin disc of alloy that had no right to interrupt a modern rifle round, and yet did. The casing fragmented. The lead core deformed. Not stopped entirely, nothing that small could truly stop such violence, but scarred enough, ruined enough, deflected enough to steal the bullet's final authority. The projectile twisted, ripped fabric, scored flesh, and fled the body without claiming lungs or heart, instead carving a shallow tunnel across muscle and skin with a heat that seared but did not destroy. He screamed then, not in pain at first, but in terror delayed, the body finally releasing what the mind could not carry. Smoke from distant shelling drifted overhead, indifferent. The sniper did not fire again. He did not need to know the result. He never saw what changed history by a millimeter. The soldier lay stunned, heartbeat hammering into a chest that had been meant for silence. Fingers clutching something inside his coat that should not have been there, a coin. Bent into an impossible shape, hot against the body as if pulled fresh from a furnace, bearing a gouge where death had tried to write its name and failed. And around him, war kept breathing, unaware that it had just been refused by something no larger than memory. The world did not change when he survived. It simply continued. Shells still muttered in the distance, machine guns still spat from unseen corners. The grey sky still pressed low and heavy against ruins, as if waiting its turn, and yet for the man on the ground, existence returned in fragments, like sound slowly rewinding into his ears, like breath rediscovering its rhythm after being evicted by shock. A voice reached him first, distant and alarmed, then hands rough, urgent, real, pressing into his jacket, opening wool and cotton and skin, fingers red with readiness for blood that did not come. A combat medic dropped to one knee beside him, cutting away fabric with shaking certainty and eyes trained to expect the worst, pulling open the coat not gently but honestly, exposing the pale chest prepared for catastrophe and stopping. There was no cavitation, no widened wound, no arterial spray. only a scorched line drawn across flesh, like a cruel signature, still smoking faintly in the cold air. The bullet had kissed the body and moved on, unwilling or unable to stay. The coin was found next warped, darkened, its face unreadable, wedged unnaturally into quilted lining where heartbeats once rested in private. It rattled free and fell into the medic's palm with a weight that felt absurdly heavy for something so small. Around them, other soldiers leaned in despite the danger, crouching low, drawn by instinct toward what should not have happened, toward a wound that refused to obey training. No one spoke at first. There was only the sound of breathing, his, ragged and real, and the distant mechanical violence of a war that had nearly taken it away. The medic wrapped the wound carefully, as if dressing not just skin but fortune, and scribbled in his report what he could without admitting wonder. Bullet deflection, superficial laceration, foreign object impact. But in the quiet of the moment, with smoke rising from something never meant to be armor, paperwork lost its authority. The soldier was lifted, carefully, like someone who had fallen through time, rather than rubble, and carried back through streets that still expected to kill him. Behind them, the sniper moved on to another window, another street, another silhouette. He would never know what he missed. But in a dim aid station that smelled of iodine and damp wool, one man stared into his hands at a ruined coin and understood something without language. History had brushed past his heart and left a fingerprint behind. Survival did not arrive as relief, it arrived as displacement. A hollow sensation as if life had slipped sideways without warning, and now nothing quite fit the same way again. And once the soldier was carried away from the street that had almost buried him and into the antiseptic half-light of a field hospital, the war did not loosen its grip so much as tighten it differently. The wound, though shallow, burned with a quiet persistence, a reminder that flesh remembers what steel could not finish. And each time his heart beat beneath the bandage, it seemed louder than before, as if protesting the story it had nearly stopped telling. Doctors spoke clinically, their words thin against the weight of implication, describing trajectories and angles, congratulating chance while avoiding its consequences. The coin was placed beside him at first like evidence, then like an artifact, passed between nurses with the hushed curiosity usually reserved for fossils or relics. Its edges split and blackened, its face erased, no longer money but momentum frozen into metal. Other soldiers came to see it. Quiet men, exhausted men who had stopped believing in outcomes brought photographs and bent spoons and tiny books and warm rings in their own pockets and held them closer as if heat might travel through stories as well as skin. Word spread through the unit, not loudly, not officially, but with the soft urgency of rumor shaped by need. Conversations paused mid-sentence when he entered rooms. Hands brushed pockets unconsciously. No one said miracle, but everyone thought it. And yet for the man himself, celebration felt false, even obscene, because survival was not a trophy and did not feel like victory. It felt like haunting. Nights brought back the sound before the sound, that hollow instant where the body waits to learn if it will still belong to itself, and he would wake with his hand gripping air, searching again for warmth that proved he was still arranged in one piece. The hospital moved him along with practiced efficiency, stitching up damage and shipping men out as soon as absence of death allowed, but he did not move through recovery like others. He carried time differently now. Each hour seemed borrowed. Each breath behaved like something issued without guarantee. And when he finally returned to his unit, thinner, quieter, wearing the same coat that had once betrayed him and then protected him, there was no applause. There was only recognition not of heroism, but of nearness. He had been where they all suspected they were going. He had stepped through and returned. And from that moment on, his presence did something subtle and permanent to the men around him. It made death personal again and survival imaginable. The war did not pause to understand what had happened, but institutions always do, eventually. And within weeks the incident found its way into paperwork, not as legend but as anomaly. reduced to technical language and tucked into the endless archives where improbable survival is filed like a clerical error. Military doctors referenced it not in awe, but in marginal notes beside other strange data points. Bullets slowed by hymnals, jackets burned by fragments, steel belt buckles split like fruit under impact. These were not celebrated so much as tolerated, because armies prefer control and stories like his refuse to be commanded. Officially, nothing changed. Uniforms were not redesigned. New orders were not issued. No booklet advised soldiers to carry coins into battle. But among historians and medical examiners, the case joined a quiet lineage of unsettling proof that modern warfare, for all its mechanized certainty, never eradicated randomness. Projectile physics is exact, but battlefields are not laboratories. Bullets struck wet cloth, oil-stained fabric, human curvature, bone angles, pocket junk, notebook spines. And once in a rare stretch of probability, something tiny interrupted something terminal. In post-war years, memoirs surfaced describing similar moments with eerie consistency. Soldiers in Italy whose cigarette cases shattered a round bound for the lungs. Airmen whose helmets cracked open shrapnel's jaws, infantrymen whose Bibles wore the wounds their bodies did not. None of it implied invincibility. Most who were hit died. Most who carried trinkets did not need them. These stories did not describe a system, they described exception. And yet, it is exception that leaves footprints in memory. In one regimental letter preserved in an archive, an unnamed soldier wrote simply, "I saw a man live because the war hit his past instead of his future." No date. No signature. But the sentiment lingered. The military, though unmoved outwardly, absorbed the lesson inwardly, where doctrine could not reach into the quiet understanding that a war refined by technology still surrendered control to chaos. The bullet did not care who was righteous or skilled or afraid. It did not recognize medals or prayers. And yet, sometimes, it lost. And when it did, the reasons were never strategic. They were personal. A coin. A photograph. A fragile weight of meaning in a pocket never designed to resist history's heaviest force. And so long after the rifles fell silent, these small intrusions into ballistic certainty continued to echo, not in manuals, but in the space where soldiers try to understand why they lived when others did not. War teaches efficiency, but survival teaches humility. And the story of a man living because something ordinary stood between his heart and a rifle dismantles every illusion that war pretends to offer about control. The planners had maps. The engineers had equations. The sniper had training, optics, breath discipline, and gravity on his side. And still, history was interrupted by something no one had designed to matter. Not steel armor. Not strategy. Just an object once warm in a human hand, now warm again for reasons no one had planned. It is tempting to call this fate, or God, or luck, but those words are too large and too easy. The truth is smaller and colder and somehow more profound. War does not decide who deserves to live. It only applies pressure. And under that pressure, the world behaves unpredictably. Metal bends, angles shift. Trajectories wander, and sometimes, impossibly, a future survives its own calculation. The coin did not save the soldier because it was special. It saved him because it existed. Because he carried something unnecessary into a place where nothing was meant to be human. Because war reached for a life and touched its history instead. And that may be the quiet meaning left behind when the guns go silent, not that survival is earned, but that it is given without explanation, and therefore must be carried with care.